Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council. As you introduce this, the item under consideration is a proposed ordinance that would require bicycle parking for new commercial and multifamily developments. And for the benefit of those who may not have been here last time, I thought I'd run through the presentation that was given at the prior council meeting and then discuss some of those potential proposed amendments that have been reviewed as well. Just a little bit of background. Currently, the city only regulates motor vehicle parking for commercial and residential developments and does not include or currently have any provisions that relate to the parking of bicycles. The city does have a fairly high bicycle use, and according to the 2000 census, it was reported that almost 25% of workers either walked, biked, or used non-vehicular means to get to work, and that 3% of the city's total, and it was over 3% of the city's total journey to work trips were made by bicycle, which places the city in about the top 1% of the nation for bicycle use. As Jen reported, the city's 2008 survey reported that 10% of respondents regularly biked to work or school. I think she reported the 2010 at 9%. And the most recently released 2009 American Community Survey reported the city's journey to work trips by bicycle had increased from the prior 3% to 4.2%. So we've seen some increased use of bicycles as a means of transportation. Just a little bit of background. In the spring of last year, the transportation, that being 2010, the Transportation Commission reviewed the updating comprehensive plan for implementation items and activities related to their responsibilities. And so they reviewed the comp plan and looked at items that had been recommended to set their agenda for that year. Section 364 of the city's comprehensive plan states that the city should develop bicycle parking requirements for new multifamily and commercial developments. And Implementation Action 31155 continues to state that the city should improve existing bicycle parking opportunities through the provision of covered bicycle parking and require that future commercial and multifamily residential developments include bike parking facilities. The Commission took that as one of their agenda items to work on during that year, and in the process reviewed ordinances from 13 different communities, including Boise, Coeur d'Alene, Sandpoint, Ada County, Ashland, Boulder, Chico, Corvallis, Davis, Eugene, Fort Collins, Madison, Missoula, and Palo Alto. They worked on it for a series of months to develop a draft ordinance, and in August of 2010, the Transportation Commission recommended approval of proposed ordinance to move forward to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council. On November 10th of last year, the Planning and Zoning Commission conducted a public hearing on the matter and recommended approval of the ordinance to the City Council. That was then reported to the Administrative Committee on November 22nd, and due to the holiday schedule, we decided to hold off until after the Christmas period to bring the matter forward for public hearing, and so that was brought forward on January 18th, the last meeting of the Council, for the Council's consideration. And the Council conducted a public hearing on the proposed ordinance and decided to table the matter to tonight's meeting to allow for greater opportunity for public input on the proposed draft. The proposed ordinance would require the provision of bicycle parking for new commercial and multifamily developments and during change of use and or expansion. It would establish a number of parking spaces required by various land uses, much as our motor vehicle parking is. It would establish standards for bicycle parking in defining what are acceptable bike rack types, and there are those that support the bike in an upright position in a minimum of 2 locations on the frame. Typically, the inverted U is the preferred bike rack. They would prevent the wheel of the bicycle from tipping over and would enable the locking of the frame and one or both wheels at a single point of contact. The ordinance itself also speaks to the ability to do creative and artistic bike racks, and so we certainly didn't want to impede on the ability to do the Artful Bike Rack program or other artistic expression in bike racks. It also provides guidance regarding the location and lighting of bike parking areas, generally to be near an entrance in an area that is lit to discourage theft and vandalism. The ordinance does require sheltering to accommodate longer-term users, 25% of the commercial developments and 50% for multifamily residential uses. And it also established bike rack spacing standards. So a bike parking space would be defined as being 24 inches by 72 inches. With a spacing of 48 inches between bike racks and the provision of aisles for larger bike parking areas. There's language related to bicycle trailer parking. There is no standard, but it's just generally recommended for uses that might have more bicycle trailer use, that they might orient the racks in a manner that would accommodate the parking of bicycle trailers. And it provides for administrative variances for existing developed sites where we had a potential change of use. It would allow for deviations of bike rack spacing, sheltering, where the zoning administrator determines that such variances are reasonable and not in conflict with the intent of the code in consideration of an existing site as it's developed. And it also allows the displacement of up to 10% of the required motor vehicle parking spaces to accommodate the provision of bicycle parking. And lastly, it provides an opportunity for phasing of bicycle parking where you have a particular land use where bike parking demand may be uncertain or where there is a lack of suitable bike access to the development site. The couple things to clarify is the proposed bike parking requirement would not apply to the Central Business District. Generally, many properties within the Central Business District are fully developed to their property lines that preclude their opportunities for installation of bicycle parking on private property. And generally, the Central Business District has been managed as a public parking facility in the downtown core that is managed by the city. And it was anticipated by the Transportation Commission and the Planning and Zoning Commission that the bicycle parking would be managed in a similar fashion. It would not apply to university-owned and operated facilities. The university, as a state entity, is not subject to the city's zoning code's requirements, but it would apply to privately owned or operated facilities that may be on or near the University of Idaho's campus. We went through a table at the last meeting where we had an example of uses and the required bike parking that would be or the bike parking that would be required both in spaces as in racks, as we discussed this at the last meeting. And then we get to the amendment section. After the last meeting, Stephen, from the Executive Director of the Chamber of Commerce, had expressed some concerns on some elements of it from the business community. And so Stephen and I met to discuss some of those, as well as some ways that the ordinance could be improved to provide greater clarity as to how it would be applied, as well as to address some of those concerns or questions that he had received from the business community. And so we identified those, and some of those, as I mentioned, were just really clarifications, providing greater clarity about how it was going to be applied and administered, and some were some changes to the ordinance. And there's an amended version of the ordinance that includes those changes that's in your packet today, along with a memo that describes and details those, and we'll go through those changes. Section E5A2 was amended so that bicycle parking would be only required with a new building, a change of use, or an expansion of an existing use. So we did modify that to clarify that area. Section E5A3 was also amended to clarify that in the case of an expansion of an existing use, the bicycle parking requirement will only be based upon the area of the expanded use and not the previously existing area. Section E5B was amended to clarify that existing bicycle parking racks, even though they may not be the preferred type or meet the standards as defined under the ordinance, would be counted towards satisfying the bicycle parking requirements, and thus preserving the existing investment that a business or property owner may have in racks that they have already previously purchased or installed. Section E5D, which relates to the sheltering, there is an alternate language option that's available to the council. That section starts off that no less than a certain percentage of bike parking would be required to be covered. There is an option to insert, it is recommended that, and therefore it would not be, if you chose the option of inserting the recommended rather than no less than language in that section, then sheltering would not be a mandatory requirement, and language would remain to provide guidance to those who may wish to do so. Section E5H was actually a new section. You may have, in the previous portion of my presentation, discussed the existing developed areas and the administrative variances that were allowed to reduce the motor vehicle parking to accommodate the provision of bicycle parking. Section E5H has also been expanded to include new uses, new commercial uses, and will allow for the reduction of motor vehicle parking by 10% where bicycle parking is provided in accordance with the ordinance. So it will allow an opportunity to offset some motor vehicle parking if that was desired by the business or developer. Section E5J is a new section that pertains to multi-tenant facilities. So these are shopping centers, shopping malls, that would allow the zoning administrator to determine an overall bike parking requirement for the facility. In many instances of those types of uses, we have activities that may be occurring at different times, and we have a potential to create joint use bike parking facilities rather than individually calculated for every individual business that's there. That would allow a potential reduction of the number of required bike parking spaces for those shared common facilities. And in Section E5K would also allow, under existing multi-tenant facilities, if you had significant changes of use, it would allow an opportunity for a phased implementation of any required bicycle parking that may be required with a change of use over time. So the council actions this evening, the options are, certainly the public hearing has not yet been reopened, but the council has the option and opportunity to reopen the public hearing and to accept additional testimony. And upon consideration of that testimony, the council may consider the proposed ordinance under first reading, consider it the proposed ordinance under suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete separate readings, reject the proposed ordinance, or take such other action as deemed appropriate. So with that, I would try to answer any questions that the council may have.
Thank you, Bill. We appreciate the thoroughness of your report and your follow-up subsequent to the previous meeting on this topic. Does the council have any questions for Bill? Walter?
Thank you, ma'am. Bill, am I correct that the proposed changes or alternatives that you just went through, you said would develop between you and the director of the chamber? And I believe those were done prior to the chamber board voting on this ordinance. Is that correct?
I believe that's the case, and Stephen can certainly speak to that more directly. I believe the council considered this. It was on the 18th. Steve and I met, and that was a Tuesday due to the Monday holiday that week. I believe Stephen and I met on Thursday morning on the 20th. We discussed and identified these potential changes, and I committed to getting a revised ordinance to him. I believe the chamber board then had a meeting that afternoon and took their position that day. But I believe Stephen discussed some of the changes with that board, and I would certainly encourage maybe to ask that question to Stephen if you open the public hearing.
Walter?
And my final question on this is, have you met with the chamber or the chamber's representatives regarding these items since they voted?
I distributed the revised draft to Stephen for him to share with the chamber leadership, and we received some communication back and forth via email, but we have not met in person.
Okay.
Other questions of Bill?
Wayne does.
Wayne?
I'm just trying to look at something to spatially fit. If we looked at a 12-unit apartment complex, each unit being 2 or 3 bedroom, then according to this, they'd be required to have 2 spaces per unit. Is that correct?
It does vary on the number of bedrooms. So if it was a 2-bedroom unit, under the revised, there is a slight alteration to the bike parking in the multifamily. I apologize, didn't cover that. It would be for a 1-bedroom unit, it would be 1 bike parking space, so that's essentially half of a rack. For a 2-bedroom unit, it would be 1.5 spaces, and for a 3-bedroom unit, it would be 2 spaces. So essentially, you have a rack and a half for or I should say, less than 1 rack for a 2-bedroom unit and 1 rack for a 3-bedroom unit. So if to make the example simple, if you had a 12-unit building that had 3 bedroom units within it, they would be required to provide 12 racks.
12 spaces.
12 racks then. For a
12
12-unit
racks or
apartment.
12?
2
units?
spaces
3
per
bedroom.
unit for a 3-bedroom, 1 rack
12 units.
generally can accommodate.
Okay.
6 then.
4 feet between racks makes it 96 feet. Is that, am I thinking of that correctly?
If you
12 units, 2 bike racks per unit, it's 24 bike racks,
1 bike rack per unit.
1 per unit, okay.
Right.
So then, if it's 1 per unit, so we have 12 times 4 is 40, it's about 50 feet then. My question is, are they able to utilize green space to put that in?
You're not required, under this ordinance, there is not a requirement for you to pave underneath the location of the bicycle racks. They would be required to be permanently anchored to the ground, so you would want to set them in concrete. But if you wanted to gravel underneath or something like that in the bike parking area, that would be an acceptable alternate surfacing.
Okay, but there's a requirement that a certain amount of setback be utilized for green space when you build an apartment.
There are requirements for setbacks from property lines, and
They
there
could
are,
utilize those setbacks to put these
Correct.
bike racks in.
correct. This is not a structure, so it would not be subject to setbacks. Correct, if that's the question.
Dan?
Little clarification for me since I wasn't here last time. Looking at the table we've got in the ordinance. First off, we talk about number of parking spaces required, motor vehicle and bicycle. Now, we're talking bicycle spaces or bicycle racks.
These are spaces.
So I could have say we get a rack from downtown, one of the kind of A-frame style racks. How many bike parking places is that?
One rack is assumed to provide 2 bike parking spaces, 1 on either side.
Okay, and then I'm looking at it here, and I see asterisks for high schools, commercial schools, and educational institutions, but I don't see what the asterisks refer to. It's on page 7 of 7 in the newest part.
I'll need to take a look at the zone. Those are existing. Those aren't changes or new insertions. I'll have to take, since we don't have the full off-street parking section there, I can take a look at the zoning code and
Okay.
maybe answer that
Yeah,
question for you. But they're not new additions.
Okay. That clears it up.
Others have questions of Bill? How would the council like to proceed?
I'll move we reopen the public hearing.
Second.
Okay, we have Sue's motion and Wayne's second for reopening the public hearing, begun on the 18th, and Randy is poised to say something.
I just wanted to try to answer that question. If you look at the table in the general table in the code, those double asterisks for high school, commercial school, and educational institutions, it says that they're exempt from having to meet the minimum number of off-street parking spaces if the requirement would result in 5 or fewer such spaces. So that's the way it fits into the text. It just doesn't, it really probably should be added to the text because it's got those dots, suspension points. It would have been more clear to just put it in there, but we'll see what happens today.
Is that clarification? We have a
Les has something.
Yes, Les?
If I could just add one last thing to help clarify the question from Councilmember Kraus. You were asking about, in that scenario of apartments, how much room that would take. And just to give you an idea, if you were to consider a vehicle parking stall that's 8 feet by 20 feet long, standard stall, you could fit 6 bicycle racks, 12 spaces within that stall, with the dimensions that are in this proposed ordinance.
Okay.
So give you an idea of just kind of a footprint.
I just had a clarification from Randy when he was saying would result in 5 or fewer spaces. Car spaces, bike spaces, what spaces you were talking about on the asterisk?
This just says off-street parking spaces.
It doesn't specify what
Well,
it's for.
if it's in the, if I may.
Okay.
I would say if it's in the existing code, it's probably
cars.
car spaces.
Okay, that's what I'm checking.
You may want to fix that.
We can certainly
Future if you
clarify
need
that. Under those
Horse
uses,
wagon.
under those uses, it's very unlikely you're going to run into many situations that would, for a school or a high school or commercial school, where you'd have less than 5 parking spaces if you're required.
Okay, I'm just checking.
Okay, so we have Sue's motion and Wayne's second for reopening the public hearing on this topic, and we'll start the roll call vote with you, Walter.
Aye.
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 Okay, that motion carries.